ready to get this thing started again? All right, great. I'll take it. All right, next we have Matthew Barlow coming up. He's a cloud infrastructure lead at StratusGrid. He's a cloud infrastructure, he's worked in, he works out of the office here in Chattanooga, North Chattanooga, at the Business Development Center in North Shore. Previously, he worked at Rackspace as a principal engineer where he partnered with Pivotal on digital transformation efforts at Fortune 500 companies. Matt, come on up here, man.
Okay, so I really appreciate everybody coming to talk about this stuff today. I would say the topic, I don't mean for it to be negative necessarily, but it's just the reality of the situation that we're in right now, I think, as companies are implementing DevOps and trying to follow DevOps practices that a lot of businesses are not doing it very well. And at least that's been my experience. So I am a cloud infrastructure lead. I work at StratusGrid. And I've been working with companies for many, many years now. I'm a frontline engineer on the operations side. And unfortunately, especially for the larger companies that I've been involved with, DevOps has tended to be maybe implemented only halfway. And I've kind of found a lot of different anti-patterns and traps that I think businesses fall into that I'm going to talk about today. So, I mean, just like a quick show of hands, how many people here have ever worked on a dysfunctional team at some point in their career? Okay, so today what we're going to talk about is like a lot of what can cause that, especially in engineering organizations. And I have some ideas for solutions, but solutions can be a little tricky, especially when you're like an individual contributor within a company, because a lot of the fixes are going to come from the leadership level usually. But we're going to talk through all of that. So let's start by talking about what makes DevOps desirable. And one of the things that I think is really cool about DevOps is that it's something that not only leadership can get behind, but also frontline engineers as well. Because, I mean, from leadership, it's desirable because it promises things like faster velocity, better code quality, and from like an individual contributor perspective, you're promised like a better work environment. So one of the things that I think really speaks to leadership and the reason for companies going through like digital transformation and DevOps transformation comes back to this article that was written by Andreessen Horowitz in 2011, which is that software is eating the world. And the biggest point from that article was that every business is becoming a software business. So what this means is like going forward, 10, 20 years from now, there are going to be even more people working within our field, and we really owe it to them to help solve a lot of the problems that we're encountering right now to create healthy work environments. But for businesses, it's important because leaders are looking things at velocity and code quality. And then us, on the front lines are looking for having a good culture and good work environments. So compared to the promises of DevOps, it often feels like, very chaotic. And I think back still, like we have a lot of the same dysfunctions that we had before we started working towards DevOps practices. Like, for example, it reminds me of working in a kitchen. Like I worked in a kitchen once when I was in college, and the wait staff and the kitchen staff were always at odds. There was just like that built-in kind of competition and constraints going on, and it could lead to like a lot of dramatic issues. And it still kind of feels that way, and especially because of this middle bullet point right here, where what I see a lot of companies doing is they're implementing DevOps as a DevOps team. And really, like DevOps is at that point just your standard operations team that now has infrastructure as code and CI/CD responsibilities. So that doesn't really solve the issues of DevOps. Another problem that I see is like we're dealing with endless migrations, and replatforming. So there's like for example, like companies are migrating to AWS, and then they decide halfway through they're going to migrate to GCP, or they're going to upgrade to something like Apache Mesos or Cloud Foundry, and then those kind of lose the battle to Kubernetes, and then we're going to migrate again. So like these endless kinds of replatforming efforts that can accumulate a lot of tech debt. And then the last thing is, probably the worst thing that I see is that DevOps becomes the single throat to choke at the business. And this really is a result of the second item that I have here, where DevOps is just like an operations team with added responsibilities. It gets to the point where it's sort of like the joke that we heard on one of the slides earlier, where it said, like, if you ever have any troubleshooting problem, the problem is DNS, and if it's not DNS, it's still DNS. But just substitute DNS for DevOps. That's how it feels sometimes. So let me talk a little bit about my gradual relationship with DevOps, and then I'm going to get into like some very specific stories on how I started to discover that there were real issues with how it was being implemented. So when I first started off, things were very simple. There were dedicated servers, and I was like a systems administrator, basically. So I would log into a server, and I had no insight whatsoever into how code was being pushed to the servers. In fact, I would say pushed to production, but in fact, back in those days, there weren't even really production environments. Everything was production. So code would be like usually transferred with FTP to a server, and then I would be called in the middle of the night to log into the system and try to figure out why things weren't working. Sometimes we were making code changes just live on the server, and a lot of times even source control wasn't being used. So it was very manual. And about 10 years later, I went to work at Rackspace, and this was still before anybody had been talking about DevOps. And I was one of 150 Linux sysadmins, and we were managing over 20,000 servers. And every time we'd log into a server, we didn't have any aliases, any environment info, none of our standard tooling. It was just basically a vanilla server with the code running on it. And I found that I was logging into the same systems over and over and over again every day, and running the same commands and following the same troubleshooting steps. And not only that, but all of the other administrators were doing the same thing. So I started working with people on automation, and we started developing tools and using code repositories and storing snippets of troubleshooting code, and developing systems so that we could log in and have all of our aliases and everything like centralized and loaded onto the systems. And that was the first time that I really started thinking about automation, and I was super excited about it. And then a little bit later on, the cloud, people started migrating to the cloud. We had API-driven infrastructure, we had containers, and we needed somewhere to run the containers, and that's when we started thinking about platforms. But where I really started to get involved in transformation efforts and involved in companies that were trying to make the shift from their old kind of waterfall style approaches to following Agile and DevOps practices was in about 2018. And this is when I partnered with a company called Pivotal. So Pivotal had like a really interesting business model where they would go to huge companies and charge them tens of millions of dollars to digitally transform. And what happened, but I think where kind of Pivotal went wrong in one way, though, was that they really undervalued the purpose of operations or the need for operations. In fact, they believed that operations wasn't needed at all. And if you had the perfect platform, they even had a tool called Operations Manager, which they codenamed, or everybody called it OpsMan, and it was supposed to do all of the operations for you. But you still needed people to, unfortunately, OpsMan couldn't do everything, and you still needed people to manage OpsMan. So you still needed operations staff. And especially at the larger companies, this became very apparent as they were going through their digital transformation efforts. And the digital transformation efforts were like, they covered pretty much all areas of software development. It included like implementing DevOps, it included agile and extreme programming practices, containerization, and even a container platform. So where I was called in was to provide the ongoing operations support, which people ended up needing. So my experience of working with those businesses was that this is when like the dysfunction became very apparent to me, and it's interesting because this according to this Gartner survey, 76% of companies are less than 50% of the way through their transformation efforts, and this really coincides perfectly with my experience because I probably worked with about 10 different like large businesses that are, from the operations side that are going through DevOps transformations. And I can think of one or two that are doing it really well, or where they were doing it really well, but the vast majority of them were pretty much failing miserably. So now that I've kind of given you some backstory, I'm going to talk about some specific stories and red flags that I've encountered, out in the wild. This first one was right after I started working with Pivotal, and I was at a conference and I was meeting with somebody who was a vice president at one of the largest grocery store chains in the United States. And now keep in mind, this company, like I said, was paying tens of millions of dollars to have like a massive transformation of their business. And they were also migrating to Kubernetes. And this vice president looked me right in the eye and said, "Has anybody ever completed a digital migration successfully?" And that's when that's like put a seed in my head where I started wondering and thinking about this. The next thing was when I was speaking with someone who worked at Pivotal and had been there since the very beginning and had seen hundreds of companies go through migrations. And we were talking specifically about pair programming. And he said that in order for a company to implement pair programming, it says VP here, but I think he actually said that it takes a C-level that must stake their career on it. And I believe the same thing applies to DevOps and DevOps transformation efforts, because a lot of the requirements in order to successfully implement DevOps are going to, they may compete against other business initiatives and may not be compatible with them for the time that it's being implemented. And this is when I started getting upset. So I started working at a company that was going through some migration efforts from VMware to AWS, and their DevOps setup was really dysfunctional. In fact, I think it was symbolized by the fact that they had a Slack channel called Need DevOps Now. And any problem that you had at the business, DevOps was always the front line, the first people to call for any issue that arose. And that Slack channel was on fire. This company had turnover, I think, on pretty much a weekly basis. Another company that I started working at, they're one of the largest clothing brands in the United States, and I was working on supporting their e-commerce site in platform operations. And this is a really good example of how DevOps can be impacted by things like, earlier we had that great talk about finance. So how can things like finance and compliance and other groups influence your ability to practice DevOps? And at this particular company, they had a change freeze from October to December every year. And that meant no code updates and no platform updates. And we would start on January 1st performing upgrades. So you can't just upgrade, after you've been kind of, stagnant for 3 months. You can't just upgrade from version 1 to version 3. You have to go from 1 to 1.9 to 1.9 to 2 to 2 to 2.9 and so on. So we would prepare the upgrade. We would have to go to a change management board, follow the ITIL processes, get sign off from 7 different teams, schedule it, and then go to do the upgrade in the middle of the night, and then it might fail, and then we would have to go through the whole process again. So what ended up happening was that we would be performing upgrades literally the entire year until October, and we would finally get the system up to date just in time for the change freeze to go into effect again. And then the last problem that I see is, or the last red flag was endless platform migration. So this is actually the same company that had the Need DevOps Now Slack channel. But what had happened was they were migrating from VMware to AWS, and we were working nights and weekends to get the first few services kind of over the bar to get them running in AWS. And after having worked on this really diligently, One day, the VP of engineering came to our team meeting and said that there's been a change of plans and that we were now migrating to GCP. So now we had like the old stuff, and then we had the stuff running in AWS, and we had to start thinking about the migration to the next platform. And I'll get into some of the reasons why that happens soon. So based on these experiences that I've had, I've kind of distilled everything down into what I think are some DevOps anti-patterns and different traps that companies fall into. So the first thing that I want to say is that DevOps is inseparable from technology, but that doesn't mean that it is technology. So this is a trap that I think a lot of companies fall into, is that you can just implement a new platform and then you're going to be doing DevOps. But nothing could be further from the truth. Like, you still have to have people that are managing the platform, and if you're not fixing like the relationship and the organizational issues, then you're not actually you're not going to reap the benefits of the DevOps promises that we talked about. But the flip side is also true, that DevOps is inseparable from technology. And what I mean by that is that when you make technology changes, that's really going to affect the health of DevOps within your company. Because if you have like, it's sort of like if you have like a piece of inefficient code, when you're running at a small scale and there's not a lot of load on it, it could be operating fine. But as soon as you like release it into production or run performance tests on it, those little inefficiencies can break down. And the same thing is with DevOps. If you're on a startup or a small team, you can get away with a lot, but once you start like making technology changes and forcing things like replatforming and migrations, that's when your system can start to break down. Another issue that we see is this, I mean, this is just based on my experience, is that there's frequent leadership turnover, especially at tech companies. And what happens is that like leaders usually are not replaced when things are going really well. Like what happens is you get into a really dysfunctional situation, maybe in your engineering organization, and there's, a new leader is brought in, and they're usually going to implement a bunch of changes, but if they don't address like the root causes of the dysfunction, then you're pretty much just going to be adding more technology and accumulating more technical debt without resolving the underlying issues, and then a couple years there's again another turnover. So this is something that I also see pretty frequently, is that like, why are so many migrations happening? Like, why is replatforming happening so often, which has a big effect on your ability to work well as a dev and operations team? And I think a lot of time this is due to business incentives. I've seen this multiple places where I've worked, and for example, like, Azure is really well known for this, like, but all of the, and I don't blame any vendors or cloud providers for doing this, they all do it. But to give like the Azure example, like they may come to you and say, to an executive that, hey, you're using Office 365, we're gonna give you Office 365 for free if you will agree to migrate like 10% of your workload to Azure. And we'll throw in Microsoft Teams. And then at that point, I don't know what's worse, the migration or having to use Teams, but yeah, so this is something that can cause a lot of upheaval in the companies when you haven't completed a transformation to DevOps. The next thing is over-engineering. So this is, I kind of picked on the leadership a little bit, but from an engineering standpoint, I'm guilty of this as well. But what can happen is, like, let's say you are migrating to Azure and you spend like an entire year building out all of the scaffolding and everything to start running your services on there. And maybe you're building out like Kubernetes and Istio and different CI/CD software and so on, and getting everything ready. And by the time you migrate the first service, you realize that there's a whole lot that you didn't think about. And then you're going back and redesigning and re-engineering for that. And to tell you the truth, like migration specifically, like very few companies actually complete a migration to a new platform. In fact, I was speaking with someone recently who was working for a company that was migrating from EC2 to Kubernetes, and they had 2,000 services. And after 2 years of working on the migration, I asked him, like, how many services have you actually migrated and are running on Kubernetes now? And he was really reluctant to give me an answer, but I finally got it out, and it was 20 services that had been migrated after 2 years of work. The next thing is to be realistic about your ability to transform. So, we had the great finance talk earlier, and that cleared things up for me a little bit. I'm not 100% sure I have this right because I don't know finance very well, but from my perspective, it seems like many businesses see software development as a profit center, but they see operations as a cost center. So, the delivery teams or the service teams, they're delivering features that are going to make money for the business, but operations is often seen as a team that just keeps the lights on. So this has a really big impact on a lot of the problems that we see, and it's one of the main reasons why I don't agree with saying that if you have an operations team with infrastructure and code and CI/CD, that now you're doing DevOps. That's not what DevOps is about, and you're still going to be in this same situation. But the problem is now that you have this DevOps team who's working on firefighting pretty much all the time, but doesn't have the investment to actually develop a platform, a solid platform, and evolve it. So next thing is, why are migrations happening so frequently? So I think a lot of this just has to do with I'll describe the problem first, which is this is the Gartner hype cycle, where you have an innovation trigger, let's containerize, for example, and you have a peak of inflated expectations, and then as you start implementing it, you go through the trough of disillusionment. And I think what's happening is that the innovation triggers are happening too rapidly before us, as actually implementing the new technology has a chance to climb out of the trough of disillusionment. So we're just basically stuck there. And one of the reasons for this is just the rapid change of technology. I mean, if you go all the way back to physical servers, virtualization, containerization, platforms, you have, and then you have serverless and so on. So what happens is this rate of change is happening faster than companies can actually migrate and re-architect their applications. So you just end up accumulating more and more technical debt. And this is really harmful for new people that are coming into a company, because now you have to learn not only, let's say, Circle CI or GitHub Actions, but you have to learn Jenkins. You have to not only know Kubernetes, but you have to know Chef, and you're accumulating more and more ways of doing the same thing, and it makes it really difficult to troubleshoot and to work with those kind of the sprawl of different services that you're using. So from here, I've talked about, the problems that I've identified, and I think that we're just in a place right now where we really need to get all of these out in the open and talk about them, and I'm hoping that the community can work together to come up with solutions. I have some ideas, but the fact is that these migration efforts can take so long that it's hard for me to know what actually is going to work and what doesn't work. But I have some ideas. So the first one is basically just to be aware of the red flags that I've talked about today and the different kinds of anti-patterns and fallacies and traps that businesses can fall into. So we have to talk about them and get them out in the open. One of the big ones is just, when going back to the kind of different cost center versus profit center, if you're in a situation where you're being told to, being given more and more initiatives like replatforming or migration initiatives or whatever they might be, and but you're just spending all of your day firefighting, then you might look into integrating something like a circuit breaker pattern like I have here to kind of stop the inflow of new work until you can get caught up and start to prioritize effectively. Another thing is if you're someone who's a leader, works in leadership that's in this talk, then you have a tremendous amount of influence over these problems that we're discussing. But for most of us, we don't have that, or we don't have that influence. So we have to kind of develop it in different ways. And one of them is basically to lead from the front. So I worked at a business where there was hardly any documentation for what we needed to do. And there were certain people that would come onto the team and they would spend entire days like learning how to do things, getting that knowledge out of people's heads and documenting it and sharing it with the team. And that's really, really healthy to do. Improves things a lot. Or you might go to a company where all the processes are manual and you can start working on automating things. And this is like a handy chart from XKCD that tells you like how much time do you spend on something manually, how much time can you devote to automating it, and will it actually pay off? Another piece of advice from Cal Newport, he wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he talks about generating career capital. And what this is really about is as like an individual contributor, how can you develop influence within a company? And to give like a summary of it, it's about taking on like small responsibilities at first that are as high value as possible, and then just really excelling at them. And then pretty soon you're going to be trusted with greater and greater responsibilities, and your reputation is really going to improve. And then you have the ability to influence leadership and to help us work through the different problems that we've been talking about. The next one is just influencing what you can and letting go of the rest. And especially if you're in an unhealthy on-call situation or incidents are happening every day and you're basically spending all of your time firefighting, it becomes, you become attached to it. Like we're attached to the things that we do every day, to our roles, and we identify with our jobs. But sometimes you just have to remember to take a step back. And it's kind of a platitude, like to tell you the truth, I mean, if I'm really stressed out and somebody told this to me, it's not going to necessarily make me feel better. But I think it's still important to keep in mind. And sometimes letting go means just getting out of the situation entirely. Like I know that personally, I spent probably 3 years at a company trying to improve things, and 3 years longer than I should have. And then after I left, the business completely tanked within a year, and the owner took all the money out of the accounts and fled the country. That's a true story. He probably works at a crypto exchange now. The next thing is to reset priorities. So I think it's really healthy. Like a lot of times I'll see teams have a summit. So if you and your teammates know that you're in a dysfunctional situation, try to get everybody together and just spend a week whiteboarding or examining the situation and reprioritizing. Because sometimes we're just so lost in the day-to-day that we realize that the things that we're working on don't even align with what the business objectives are. So the next steps, I really wanted to have this talk because I believe the problems that we're facing are going to, they're going to impact us, our future careers, but also the people that come after us. Because going back to what Andreessen Horowitz said, how software is eating the world, that's only going to accelerate. Over the next 10, 20, 30 years, there are going to be probably 10 times as many people in our field. The next generation is going to come along, and we kind of owe it to them and to our future selves to talk about these and experiment with solutions and to solve all of these so we can create healthier workspaces where people are happy to work on teams that are productive. So that's all I had.
We do have time for a couple questions. If folks have questions for Matt. DevOps transformations. All right, nothing. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.